Okay, good morning, good afternoon and welcome everybody. Really very pleased to be welcoming you to this session on feminist leadership. My name is Micaela Cronin. I'm the director of the Workforce Innovation and Development Institute. This is our first Fireside Chat since we've changed our name from FISI, and we're really pleased to have you all here today. We've got one of our highest turnouts to what I think is clearly a topic that people are very interested in engaging in. I'd like to begin the session today by acknowledging that we are all meeting on Aboriginal land and pay my respects to Australia's First Nations people, their elders, past, present, and those that are emerging, and the work that we need to do to ensure that we are fostering and encouraging leadership within First Nations people and thinking about how we engage them in this very important discussion. I want to just do a really quick introduction. Most of you, I'm sure, have read the bios of the people who have very generously agreed to be part of this discussion today. But I just want to make a few points about the incredibly impressive panel that we have today. They are all feminist activists. They are all leaders in their space in terms of violence against women, and they have all made a very significant contribution in that space. Most of you will know Eleri Butler, who is the CEO at Family Safety Victoria. Eleri has been in that role really since the beginning of lockdown, I think. In March last year, Eleri, you joined us. So you have yet to really experience what this sector and Melbourne is like, and looking forward to when we are able to do that. Eleri comes with this significant experience in feminist leadership. She was the CEO of the Welsh Women's Aid before she came to this role. So she brings a wealth of experience to this conversation. Dr. Emma Fulu, thank you so much for joining us today. Emma is a feminist activist who is widely published and has held some very significant roles on the international stage and is a leading global expert on violence against women. Emma is the founder and executive director of the Equality Institute and brings a really significant global perspective to this debate. So thank you very much for being here with us, Emma. Emily Mcguire. Emily Mcguire was until recently, many of you will know, was the CEO of DVRCV. She is in her own right a feminist activist who brings a great deal to this debate. She has been active for many years at a policy and advocacy level in Victoria. So this piece of research, so thank you, Emily. I'm going to hand over to you in a minute, hence the stopping for a minute. But I want to just position a little bit about this research. Emily is one of the co-writers of a piece of research that FSV funded the Institute to undertake. It came out of the leadership intensives that we've been running that many of you have participated in. I'm not going to say any more about the research because that's what I've asked Em to do as one of the writers, but it is something that we are very pleased to have been part of the exercise in the collaborative work around opening up this important discussion, which we will hand over now to Emily to talk about and look forward to the discussion more broadly. Em, if you can give us a bit of an overview of the research. Thank you. Em, you're on mute. We had to start there.
Really? I actually haven't done that in a public forum as yet, so I'm glad there's over 100 people watching me look like a Teams idiot. I was just saying, can I start by also acknowledging that I am meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I've got the hard task of trying to distill 40 pages and 20-something, almost 30 interviews into 4 or 5 minutes, so I'll have a crack. But I would really encourage you to have a look at the report. We built the report as a discussion starter, and something for that hopefully will you be able to use with peers, with colleagues, not just to sit and read as a static document, but to actually use to talk to those that you work with. We interviewed a really, really diverse group of women and people from the prevention of violence against women and the family violence sectors in Victoria. It was the research is focused around those two sectors specifically. We talked to women with disability, Aboriginal women, older and younger feminist leaders, people from the LGBTI community, people who had migrant backgrounds, women who were born outside of Australia. So we had as many diverse voices as we were able to, which was part of what made the conversation so interesting. We talked in the first stages about definitions. I was of the initial thought when we started this research that no one was going to be interested in definitions because they always feel very static. But actually what we found is that people recognise the limitations of definitions, but they really wanted something that was sector informed as a definition that they could use as a jumping off point in terms of conversation with people. Participants talked about in those conversations about how we define and understand feminist leadership and management and governance. They talked about things, some of the things that you would expect, a very intentional and deliberate focus on power, how important collaboration and partnerships is, the critical nature of collective advocacy, how central accountability and transparency is to feminist practice. But we actually also found that the participants really nicely articulated some of the unique features of feminist leadership. We went in thinking that feminist leadership was slightly different to other forms of leadership, but couldn't really quite know how, and the participants really did it for us. They talked about it having a very explicit focus on transformational social and systemic change, and that was one of the key features. They talked about how hard feminist leadership is because you are you're kind of building the plane as you're flying it, so to speak. You are modelling the change that you want to see in a world that's not ready for that yet. And that's one of the big things that came up quite consistently was what you do is obviously very important, but how you do that is just as important as a feminist leader. The report also talked to the things that our interview participants felt would better enable feminist leadership in Victoria. So they said, yes, we're clear on the big long-term generational change goal of ending violence against women and ending family violence, but how we go about doing that, how we go about progressing that journey is one of the things that we need to talk about differently and start to work more collectively on. As you would expect, the importance of adequate and sustained funding came up. Interestingly, the focus was less on the quantum of funding and more on the importance of flexibility and how that funding was used and using that funding over the longer term to measure impacts rather than focus solely on outcomes and kind of key deliverables. They talked about the importance of creating time and space, even when the funding mechanisms don't allow it, to do feminist leadership work properly. Without a doubt, we've got really high levels of commitment around feminist leadership in Victoria, but all of us, I think, recognised that it was really, really hard to practice because it's intensely time consuming and you've always sort of got that push-pull factor. And one of the most interesting elements of our discussion with the feminist leaders we spoke to, I think, is when we delved into the complexities of feminist leadership that they found in their daily work. They talked about how idealised feminist theory and how we think about feminist practice is, and how hard it is to live up to. They spoke a lot about the fact that feminist leadership practices are often unattainable. We set the framework as an unattainable framework, and then others set it up on ourselves as feminist leaders, and that is really hard. It's kind of hard to live up to, and that sort of relenting focus on accountability. Again, it wasn't that people thought accountability was bad. It was really hard to be accountable to yourself, to your theory, to your organisation, and to a wider movement and to victim survivors. And there were all of these people that the leaders we spoke to who were holding them to account, they felt, and that was seen as really, really personally and professionally difficult. And the other thing that came up when we talked about the complexities of feminist leadership was about the criticality of having really hard, courageous conversations. I think that there was a strong sense that feminist leaders are expected to have these conversations, not just with the people who sort of disagree with our movement and our practice, but within our own movement. We've all got an obligation to try and not get into the groupthink and really push the conceptual and practical agenda forward. And I think there were a few people who we interviewed who felt like perhaps that we didn't do that as well as we used to as a movement in the 70s and 80s. And finally, participants gave us really, really good guidance about why feminist leadership is actually critical to the work of the prevention of violence against women and the family violence sectors, and what it is that we need to do in order to progress that as a sector. Don't have time to go into that, but that's definitely a bit that's worth reading. So I have left a lot out, but hopefully that's a bit of a taster for you.
Thank you, Emily. And I just want to point out too that the report will be going out with the recording of this session afterwards. So as Emily said, really encourage you to take a read of that. So Eleri, I'd really like to go to you now and ask you to share with us from your personal and professional experience, which is, as I said before, very extensive, about a time or a story when your feminist leadership has had an impact on your work. How has it informed and impacted on the way you work?
Thank you, Micaela, and also I would very strongly commend the report to people who are listening in. It's a really good report, really good piece of work. So I appreciate that summary, really challenging to do. Before I go into my response, can I also acknowledge traditional owners and custodians of the lands and country that we're all respectively meeting and calling in on today, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here on the call today. I'm calling in from the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that we are all living and working on Aboriginal lands and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also actually like, in the context of the conversation, like to acknowledge the wisdom and expertise and leadership of Aboriginal women leaders in our communities, who drive our work to prevent family violence in Aboriginal communities in Victoria, and their elders and women before them who for up to 60 to 80,000 years have been doing women's leadership across these lands and how to live respectfully in communities and leading the way. And there's a lot of learning I've been doing from colleagues and community members since I've got here, albeit mostly remotely, as you mentioned. I guess in relation to my description of feminism and what that means in relation to my work, I think it's important to understand that my feminism is informed by and has developed and has changed since I've grown up, is informed by my working class Welsh background and began when I was in school. So it's many decades ago. In relation to my first involvement in feminist collectives, setting up refuges, community activism, and so on, up to most recently, as you said, when I've led services by and for communities that they serve. So I think my feminism and the feminists that I've worked with at its best and at its most thoughtful and reflective is intersectional. And by that, I think it's in relation to the way that Kimberly Crenshaw articulated that way back in 1989, I think it was, that it's not simply about being inclusive of people's identity and representation. And it's not about single issue analysis happening side by side, nor is it any kind of hierarchy of who's most victimised. I mean that Black women, for example, will experience sexism, race and gender-based discrimination, which is not just the sum of its parts. And as such, they endure specific forms of discrimination that Black men or white women may not. And it's not about inclusion by assimilation, but about how we see and change and dismantle structures of discrimination and power, which often operate together and exacerbate each other. And that's one of the things that came across, I think, really, really strongly in the report. And as you said, my feminism, as I've practiced it across my work in life, has focused on preventing family violence, preventing sexual violence, gender-based violence, male violence against women. And it's also ambitious, and that's also informed my work because it doesn't involve a sole focus on equality. For what is it to be equal within oppressive structures? Why would we set our sights so low in one way? But its focus, as again has been drawn out from the report and from the research, the focus for me is on dismantling the structural oppression women as a class experience, and therefore on the liberation of women and girls from patriarchal and intersecting systems of oppressions, whether that's racism, colonialism, homophobia, classism, ageism, ableism, transphobia, and so on, to attain that social justice for everybody. So for me, the importance of preventing violence against women, for example, in and of itself is not only about individually ensuring we achieve safety for individuals, but it's also because that's one of the central ways in which power is maintained and controlled over women and girls' lives, and how that continues. And it's perpetuated and reinforced through culturally and socially constructed norms and stereotypes, and by systems that perpetuate colonialist discriminations and so on. So the way that kind of understanding has impacted my work has obviously evolved over the years, and it's been very cumulative. So, for example, I'm really, I think it's really important that we connect that personal experience with the political, with a small p, so that, for example, when I was in government previously in the UK, we elevated and gave a platform for the voices of survivors most discriminated against, through focus groups and through action research. So speaking to women in prison, women in the sex industry, those who've been trafficked, asylum seekers, women in the mental health system, survivors of all forms of state or other forms of violence, male violence. And survivors spoke to us of state systems and sanctions that perpetuated and reinforced abuse that they'd experienced individually. And their recommendations, this is way back in the early 2000s, I think it was, mid 2000s, but their recommendations informed government strategy, the first government strategy there at the time on violence against women prevention. And the importance of that for me was the joining up of experiences, and also making that connection between individual experiences and systemic discriminations. So for feminist leadership, partly for me, is about making those connections. And so in my experience, feminist practice and leadership is not only about how we do things internally in agencies. The how we do things, as was said, is really important, as well as the what we deliver. But it's also about making it evident in our leadership in terms of campaigns, in holding each other to account, in holding states to account, in making power systems visible and transparent, and so on, and asking those questions of ourselves. Which women's voices are we not hearing in communities? Which women are furthest away from being able to access services or overcome barriers to achieving freedom or liberty? Whose lives are being most harmed by colonial, racist and other oppressive systems, for example, or exploitative industries globally or locally? And as an example, I just wanted to kind of give one example of how I've used that within my work. When I was working in Wales, we worked with specialist services who were making those connections on the ground between women's experiences of domestic and family violence, child sexual abuse, of trafficking, usually of family members, of being forced into the sex industry, of being in and out of the criminal justice system, on a revolving door of short custodial sentences. And we held symposiums with government, with policymakers, with funders, to evidence that the needs of women were not being met by the state, and the siloed approach to domestic and family violence, for example, was very much separate from responding to women in rehab for addictions, and that was separate from responding to women in the justice system, which was separate from responding to child sexual exploitation, separate from responding to child poverty, and separate to trafficking and organised crime in the sex industry. So we advocated that the violence against women strategies that we had shouldn't only focus on individual responses by services, but also on structures and interconnected systems of discrimination. We provided a voice to women who'd been involved in all of those systems. So women in poverty, migrant women, young women, women with problematic substance use, women who've been in prison. And we provided a platform to the specialist services and the women's centres that aim to provide that sort of holistic, joined up support and advocacy on the ground. And that advocacy across those broken systems, when their funding didn't enable them to do that, the funding didn't enable them to have that joined up approach. And that platform helped them make the case for sustainable funding. And we supported the sector to provide collective leadership to expose and make visible what we all know, that women don't live single issue lives, and despite the inevitable backlash from those with a vested interest, they made the case that services need to be funded, for example, to provide safe exit routes for those women who need to exit the sex industry and are not free to choose, or not free because of male violence, or not free because of their migration status, or because they face destitution, and to make the case to be funded to provide preventative interventions and prevention work in local communities, and to stand alongside women to help them recover their children, for example, and to be funded to build a movement that challenges the demand for trafficked and exploited women, children and people on which organised crime was being built. So that's kind of one example of collective activity and action, and that's how some of my feminism has had an impact on my work, is drawing those connections together, and that's really how it inspires me and how it's helped me be part of a movement for transformation. And again, that comes out very strongly from the research. I was one of the participants in the research, and I was privileged to be part of that discussion. And I think it's really important that we focus not just on equality within systems of oppression, but that we actually focus on transformation of systems and services, and for liberation. It's not enough to be safe. I think, we can design safe spaces and safe streets all we want. Women will still bear the brunt of safety work in our everyday lives. It's really important that we focus on, I think, on freedom from violence and discrimination, and when it's no longer acceptable, not for you or for me or for individuals, when it's no longer acceptable for all women and girls to experience violence and abuse, that's when we'll have achieved something significant. And that kind of reminds me of one of my favourite quotes, which is that I haven't got it word for word, but I'm not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And that just as much applies across a range of different groups of women. That must include as well the liberation of First Nations people from the systems and tools of colonisation, for example. So I just think we need to be bold in our approach, and our delivery should be informed by and rooted in self-determination, decolonisation, and in focusing on an intersectional practice, and in focusing on making sure that we dismantle those structures of discrimination. And we can each apply that, I think, to our everyday lives in relation to how we work in the sector and in our communities.
Eleri, thank you so much. You've covered a huge terrain there, and there's a lot to digest and think about. I think one of the threads too from what you've said that does weave through the research that and what Emily was talking about before is the how is as important as what, but there's a real call to action, particularly in terms of intersectionality that you've drawn there. So thank you very much for bringing those points into the conversation. Emma, I'm going to go to you, and I'd really like to hear from you about why you personally practice feminist leadership, and in your experience, building on what Eleri and Emily have both talked about too, why is it important?
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Micaela. First, also let me acknowledge I'm joining today from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and wanted to pay my deepest respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the incredible leadership work of communities in this beautiful land. Why? I mean, in a way it's sort of why not, I guess. I feel like I was born a feminist activist, come from a very diverse family, but grew up experiencing, racism, sexism, family violence in many different forms, and I think was driven to try and change that from as early as I can remember. And that's sort of driven, I guess, my life and my work. And I think, when I think about leadership, sometimes I think we get stuck on these sort of, I guess, really historically patriarchal notions of what leadership is and who gets to claim the term leader. And I would like to encourage I can see there's 155 people attending, that you're all leaders. Just because your title doesn't have CEO or in it. It doesn't mean that you're not a leader. We're all leaders in our own lives and our own communities and families. And I think part of feminist leadership is about breaking down those notions of what it looks like. So for me, I guess it was always important because it's really just a lived reality. For me, it's trying to integrate one's own values and beliefs and core essence, I guess, into our everyday lives. And so to break down the barrier between, the personal and the political, or our home and family and our work life, and to try and become integrated in the deepest sense of the word, I guess, for me personally. So I've worked, all over the world on violence against women for organizations like the United Nations and others. And I guess I probably was, as much as I loved what I did, I was often disheartened by the disconnect between what we were saying on the outside and what we were living on the inside, and as organizations, and could see that, we were doing all this work to advance equality, but internally you could see organizations that still had lots of issues with, bullying and unequal power dynamics, and that they weren't genuinely living those values from the inside out. And so eventually I started the Equality Institute with the intention to try to create an organization that deeply lived its values. Not to say that we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's a journey of trying to center that. And it sort of comes back to what Emily was talking about in terms of the how being as important as the what. So really creating the time and space to be deeply reflective, self-critical, and to recognize that this is a journey and we're not perfect, but that we are doing our best to try and live that kind of a liberation. I love that word, liberation, that Eleri was talking about. And I think what I've observed in the last few years is that this approach, this ever evolving approach, is obviously we do it because we're deeply committed to social justice and transformation. But I think, as I said to Emily, it works. Like, I think sometimes we think we're feminist activists because we are driven to do that from a moral imperative. But actually, feminist leadership and feminist organizations and organizations sort of deeply rooted in social justice, they work. And so I noticed that in COVID, I think more than ever, that when we think about businesses and organizations that have managed to thrive and that have really supported staff, and you see, I know from my own organization, just the incredible compassion and resilience and support that the team provides to each other, and the way we were able to transition to working from home, for example, and the systems that have enabled that for us to thrive is really grounded in the fact that we had built those ideas around systems and structures around feminist leadership that I think enabled us to do well despite this crisis. And I see that in the sector as well. And I've seen that in lots of areas when I think about the research that's been done. When we do, when we do work, for example, we've led a number of huge global studies or national studies. And when we do that work in a way that is safe and ethical and grounded in feminist practice, you see incredible transformation. And it's not just the outcome that we expect. It's not just I often think about studies we've done in countries where the outcome might be the research that we're trying to finish to inform policy, but actually it's the practice itself that's transformative. So we might train, hundreds of researchers, and through that process, when it's really deeply grounded and in community, and it's informed by ethics and feminist practice, that they become the next generation of activists. And that's not necessarily the outcome we'd expected, but it sort of adds these layers of impact. And so I think I wish all organisations would, take some of those principles to heart. And I do see businesses thinking about that in different ways. We're recognising that the old sort of systems of power and hierarchy don't work. They don't work for people, and they don't work for organisations. And I think it's no longer a nice to have. It's no longer. I think there's greater and greater expectations that. Whether that's organisations, individuals, communities, governments. Obviously, there's a long way to go, but I think there's greater and greater recognition that we need to do this work in ways that reflect the outcomes that we are trying to create in the world.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you, Emma. And I think that reminding us that this approach, what works and what doesn't work for people, is really important message. Thank you, Emma. Emily, I want to go back to you for a minute, Eleri. I think what Emma's talked about what works and that feminist leadership is powerful in the impact that it's able to have. We've seen quite world-leading changes and investment by government coming out of the Royal Commission into family violence in Victoria. So we have seen very significant reform and change. From your perspective as a senior leader in government, how do you see feminist leadership benefiting or impacting on the sorts of systemic reform that we're in the middle of in Victoria?
Thank you. Well, that's a big question. I can't speak on behalf of government, and I would also value and welcome others' contributions in this too, in the chat or on the panel. But from my own perspective, I think there's a couple of things I wanted to kind of acknowledge and recognise as well, that the foundations of these reforms need to be acknowledged and recognised. Wanting to acknowledge that victim survivors, not only who may be joining us here today, because we keep forefront in our minds all of those who are impacted by, who are living with violence and abuse, and for whom we undertake this work, but the huge amount of advocacy and the movement building the victim survivors have been doing across the state in Victoria to inform and to get us to where we are today, as well as the specialist services that have been working for decades across Victoria. And also recognising that both what Emily and Emma have said, that there is that longitudinal research that shows that the countries with the strongest feminist movements tend to have more comprehensive approaches and interventions and successes around preventing violence against women. And so that really plays an important role in the work that we do. In terms of a bigger role, I think the research showed than political parties, number of women legislators, national wealth, and so on. And also just wanting to acknowledge that the work that we're talking about, and which again comes out, I think, strongly from the report, the intersectional analysis that we're talking about, and the feminist intersectional approach, has its roots decades ago, from Kimberly Crenshaw, but also before in Black feminist activism,